name is Opeta, but everyone just calls me OP. I'm a PhD candidate here at DPA. And this panel was put together by a HDR colleague of ours, Jay Evett, who unfortunately, because of work, he had to miss his lovely panel which he put together. He's abroad on official work. But we have very good super sub stepping in to help us out. So just to start, I'll just read what Jay's put together and then introduce the panel briefly, and then they will introduce themselves properly and run from there. Okay, here we go. It's as true for countries as it is for people that we can get distracted by new things without first finishing what we were already doing. Where the shifting geopolitics that sandwiches the Pacific in between the new Cold War has caught our eye, we risk leaving the remains of the last century's decolonisation unfinished. This session is a kōrero between voices championing efforts to decolonise the last vestiges of direct control of Pacific peoples. Over an hour, discussants will weave their experiences, frustrations, and aspirations through a facilitated discussion to present a metaphorical map detailing what's left to do, what stands in the way, and what it'll take to get where people want to be, followed by a question and answer session. So very briefly, Solstice Middleby, PhD candidate from the University of Adelaide, who's known all over the Pacific for doing amazing things, and she's very kindly volunteered to be amazing for us this morning. We have the amazing Kenneth Cooper, in keeping with the theme of amazingness, Associate Professor of Political Science, Chamorro Studies, and Micronesian Studies at the University of Guam. Thank you for joining us and coming so far. Lisa Hope Suve Nakama, lawyer and former legal advisor to the Tokelauan government. Thank you for being with us. And our own Ronnie Kareni, West Papuan diplomat and activist. Nawale, over to you.
Thank you very much. Opeta, is this on? Yes. Good morning, everyone. Bulavanaka, morning true. It's lovely to be here with you all. We're just having some more joining us. As Opeta said, my name's Solly, and I am subbing in for Jay, who conceived of this wonderful panel, but it's a real honour to be here with these incredible humans. So Lee Hay, who's come from the South Pacific, from Tokelau. We've got Ken from the north, from Guam, and of course Ronnie, who's ours, but from the West Papua. The Indigenous Ngunnawal protocols have already been observed this morning with that very generous and beautiful welcome to country from Auntie Selena. I wanted to share with all of you that sometimes mob have shared frustrations with me when they think we don't engage authentically in those protocols. You know, when we just read the script and it's a bit performative and a bit of a ticker box thing. So I guess I just wanted to encourage everyone, you know, today to honour the spirit of that welcome, and while you're here on country, you know, treat country with respect, treat each other with respect. You've probably noticed here on Ngunnawal country, this is a real time of change. You can see it outside in the wattles blooming and the wind that's there one day and not the next, the changing temperature. So in all the learning that you do while you're here, there's also a wonderful teacher here in Ngunnawal country, so hopefully you can learn a bit from it too. And if you're not too unlucky like our friend Dr. Jejong, just avoid the magpies. But it is important, given the nature of our discussion this morning, and it's not just this panel, the next panel as well, where we're talking about decolonisation, that we do all reflect on what it means to have these conversations on unceded land. You know, for me as a settler here, and for many who live here, this is obviously about showing respect to country and to the custodians. It's also about learning and sharing stories, you know, acknowledging my own privileges and truth-telling. So you heard a bit about Ngunnawal country as a meeting place this morning. but it's also important that we recognise, and Jay wanted us to recognise that Canberra itself was, the construction of Canberra involved, the often violent displacement of people. It's involved the destruction of the native ecosystems. We have 1% left of our native grasslands, and the destruction of many sacred sites, including here at the ANU. So we've asked the panellists as well just to reflect a bit on what that means to be having these conversations on unceded land, and obviously encourage everyone to have a think about what that means for you, even if you're only here for a couple of days. One of the other colonial practices I reflect on a lot, that occurs a lot on Ngunnawal country, is related to Pacific people, so conferences, workshops, discussions about the Pacific that often don't involve the Pacific. And I was so happy to look at this program when it came out and see the effort that's been made by the organising committee, and we acknowledge Professor Regan and the big team that's worked with him on this program. So these agendas can be decolonial acts themselves, and I think when you look at the agenda you can see that this space is probably what it should be. And I think this panel certainly represents that as well. It's been a lot of care's gone into putting this panel together, and our speakers represent some of the great diversity we see in the experience of decolonisation across the region, from struggles for independence and liberation through to free association arrangements. Just to set the scene a little bit, it's important to know that more of the countries and territories in the Pacific remain under some form of colonial power. Since the 60s, 14 have achieved political independence, but only 9 in full, without some residual tie to the former colonial power. A third of the countries on the UN's list are in our region. And the most recent political decolonisation occurred now 30 years ago in Palau. Since that time, it seems to have stagnated somewhat. So we're hoping to just have a conversation today. Jay didn't conceive of this as presentations, but just a discussion. He's given us some guiding things, and hopefully we'll, traverse a lot of ground from the experiences everybody has, what it feels like, the geopolitics, how it impacts, the role of the UN, the Pacific Islands Forum, and then hopefully enough time for you all to ask questions. And I know there's probably, we discussed this morning, if we really wanted to do this conversation justice, we would need another 14 chairs, and not inclusive of this country, then maybe another 250, but we will make a start here, and hopefully it will lead to more conversations. So I've just asked to start off if each of the panel members would introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their context. Not everybody knows about all the contexts across the region, and if they want to reflect a little on what it means to have this conversation here on Ngunnawal country.
Thank you, Soling. I'll start it off. Firstly, to acknowledge the space as we gathered here, the First Nations people, the Ngunnawal, extending that respect to the elders as well, past, present, emerging. And in that acknowledgement, also reflecting on many lives this morning through our keynote speaker, already highlighted lives that have died in that fight for full freedom or sovereignty or just protection of the land and preservation of that culture, which is life. My name is Ronnie Kareni, as already introduced, a West Papuan musician, activist, or often play a role in consultation to the region with the civil society organizations on matters of West Papua, and have lived in Papua New Guinea pretty much all my life as a refugee, and probably would be the fourth wave of those massive influx of West Papuan refugees across the western half of the island of New Guinea, where the arbitrary line separates the two, the land. And been here in so-called Australia, have been advocating on the indigenous rights and reflecting as well on just the discussion around the struggle for dignity, the land rights, and the First Nations people. It is often a privilege and a honor to be able to meet with many of the First Nations people in their fight for treaty, truth-telling, and that recognition of the sovereignty, but also extending that across to the region where I'm also sitting here amongst some of the amazing leaders in this space. And as we talk about the unfinished decolonization, West Papua arguably remains a trust territory where the impacts of colonization, militarization, geopolitics in the 60s, which we see that continues to this day, where it plays in a different forms, where we see it's reflected in the text, in the communique of leaders. And that's something that we'll be reflecting upon as well and touch on a bit later in this dialogue, how the case of West Papua as well, we see that reflected in the Pacific Island Forum leaders communique. If one looks at it from 2019, text, and the recent one that came out, how that also makes the issue falls into just a one single sentence, whereas it is a nation that continues to fight against all the odds, particularly the heavy military operations, the foreign investments that is really much interest on the land, and a lot of these defense cooperation, security agreements, the bilateral engagements, all comes at the expense of the local communities. And so with that, I'll just gonna pass the mic to my other colleagues as well.
Hello, hello, hello. Hafere. Guau si Kenneth Wolfgang Cooper, tato guanzo, si Jus Masi ni Toramzo, ni Finatan Mizo Pago of Magazo, Nagagamzo Guini. I'm from Guam. I'm a professor at the University of Guam. I'm in the Micronesian Area Research Center, focusing on the international relations research agenda. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So, you know, Guam is a very interesting place. Essentially, we're a colony of the United States, and I think that's indubitably true. As part of that, you know, I'm in two more presentations, one right after this, so you're probably gonna get tired of hearing from me, but I'll save some of the detail for the next presentation. But essentially what we are is a colony of the US, and a militarized one at that. I'm very thankful that Ronnie used the word militarization, because that's exactly what we experience in Guam. 27%, roughly 27% of our 212 square mile island is currently occupied by the United States military. We have Air Force Base, Navy base, and the first Marine Corps base to be activated since 1952 opened up in Guam just this last year. There are also plans to build giant missile defense installations where the United States is experimenting with missile defense technology, first prototyping it in Guam. So Guam is the prototypical experimental laboratory for U.S. movements regarding the great power competition between the United States and China. So that's the context in which I come from. Not only is it unfinished decolonization in the sense that we are still a colony, but we also have the dual sword of dealing with the heavy militarization of the island. And these things are very intimately entangled. I call it a macabre waltz, the two ghouls that dance together to keep the Chamorro people suppressed. And so what I'm hoping we can glean from this conversation today, you know, is also thinking about being here in, you know, First Nations territory. It's an opportunity to reflect on how we can all help one another. That's something that I'm trying to glean from it as well. I did my graduate degrees in Hawaii, and part of my responsibility, what I felt, is I was there on their land, and I need to do what I can to help them, right, in whatever way that occurs. And it's not like trying to be a savior or being necessarily beside them, but being behind and taking direction from them. So I thought there was a responsibility on my part for the Kanaka Maoli of Hawaii, because we experience so much of the same types of oppression. And so being here in Australia and in First Nations territory is an opportunity, because I think our Guam doesn't get much interaction, right, with down here. So there's new forms of solidarity to be built. But to return to the introduction, I think Guam is a place that all of the Pacific should be aware of, because what's happening to us, we're at the front line of competition. And as I like to say, if the United States and China are elephants, we are the grass that gets stomped in the middle, even if one of those elephants proclaims to be on our side. So thank you.
Maloni, ko te ahate nei na haia te aliki, tātou huia maoli o liki ei. Ka he taiki te atua ki tātou wa hei loaki ma te manuia. I want to acknowledge all the protocols of this land. I want to acknowledge the ancestors. I want to acknowledge most of all God, our Heavenly Father, who has brought us here safely to this land. And I'm also very grateful and honored to the Department of Pacific Affairs for this wonderful opportunity to allow myself and my colleagues here to be here to share about our journey from where we come from, our countries. And I want to make it very clear that whatever I say today, I'll be sharing my perspective, my personal perspective and experience, for I have worked for my beautiful country, the government of Tokelau, for many years. I have had a significant contribution to Tokelau's constitutional and self-determination journey and governance from 1998 until 2019 when I left Tokelau. So I served in various critical roles within the government of Tokelau, and where my work spanned from legal and governance and social development, specifically with our communities, with our women and our youth and sport. One of my notable contribution was my involvement in the self-determination referendum processes in 2006 and 2007 under the leadership, and I want to acknowledge Professor Tony Angelo, because you all know that Tokelau is a non-self-governing territory of New Zealand. What it means that New Zealand is responsible for Tokelau in terms of developing Tokelau, preparing Tokelau for self-determination. And these referendums were a pivotal moment for Tokelau as the territory sought to determine its political future in relationship with New Zealand, the administering power. And my role in these referendums highlighted my deep commitment to ensuring that Tokelauans, that my people were fully informed and engaged in the decision-making process, reflecting her broader dedication to the principle of self-determination and governance. And I want to acknowledge here that Tokelau is very special. It has a very warm and unique relationship with New Zealand. And this is very important in terms of New Zealand's role to develop Tokelau for self-determination. And at the moment, Tokelau is very much self-autonomy. What it means, Tokelau, New Zealand has devolved a lot of authorities to Tokelau, the government of Tokelau, and her people to make her own decisions for her internal governance in Tokelau. We have the Genofono, similarly to Parliament, and we have also the Cabinet or our ministers when the Genofono is not meetings. That's at the national level to discuss matters, national matters concerning the whole of Tokelau. And at the village level, we have our taupulenga, or village councils, who are responsible for the villages for their daily affairs. So this is very unique. And I want also to emphasize here, prior to Tokelau becoming formally a part of New Zealand under Tokelau Act 1948, the villages and our customary traditions and culture were very much in order. So there was very little influence, from colonialism. But, so I'm very happy to be here, and I will share a bit more in terms of the conversation today.
Thank you, Lihe, and Ken and Ronnie. Maybe we'll just stay a little bit on the colonial history before we move to the geopolitics and the regional and international institutions. Obviously, several of the territories in the region are colonised by a colonial power that was a colony itself and has colonised other Indigenous peoples as well. Maybe, Ken, if you could, I know you mentioned the Kanaka Maoli, obviously the United States also, there's Native Americans and Samoans. Could you reflect a little bit on what that context means for Guam's own decolonisation?
Yeah, I think that's a critical question to be answered. I think as of now, we, at least in Guam, haven't had much in the way of solidarity or serious conversations with Native Americans in the United States. But that's something that needs to be done. You know, the problem, the worst thing that was happening is there were originally times in Guam where people were saying, you know what, let's become a federally recognized tribe. The Chamorros, let's become a federally recognized tribe. And a bunch of people came together and said, that sounds like a horrible idea, right? That sort of subsumes and says, that takes away in many ways your right to external self-determination. That's how we viewed it. And also, I think many tribes may not like if we became one, right? Because then we're fighting for the same pot of funding and all of these things. So I don't think that taking that model, the domestic dependent nation model from the United States, is something that Chamorros in Guam want. Even though there is a group in Guam, they're not that active anymore, but they were called the Chamorro tribe. But we don't believe that's proper self-determination. And so, you know, dealing with the United States, who is an incredibly large settler state, we're in a really, I think our insularity is an advantageous position. Because if we were located within the boundaries of the now United States, I think international law wouldn't even recognize us as having a right to external self-determination, as I'll talk about in the next presentation. And so that context is very sad for the Native Americans, but I guess in a weird stroke of luck, you know, our colonialism being overseas, the way that the world worked itself out in international law has allowed us to still remain as a place rightfully recognized as legitimately still not having exercised self-determination. And so I think there's a lot more work to be done in regards to that conversation with the Native Americans and how we can help each other. But so far, it's really been on the monks of language revitalization, cultural preservation. Those are the conversations that have been stronger rather than on a sort of political self-determination aspect. Our conversations with the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii, though, are a lot stronger because they are recognized as fully integrated into the United States. However, their kingdom was illegally overthrown, right? And so the Kingdom of Hawaii should still exist, and we are definitely in solidarity with the Kanaka Maoli in making sure that their statehood isn't extinct, and I mean statehood in the international relations sense of the word, not as a united state. Yeah.
Lihe, do you want to also comment on this? Obviously, New Zealand is also a settler colonial state, and Tokelau shares a heritage with the Maori, and we have seen increasing sort of contestation since the last election. Is there anything you'd add around this issue?
Thank you, Solly, for the question. I think I'd like to continue to acknowledge the warm and the special relationship, and I think the good thing about Tokelau. We do acknowledge that the Maori are the tangata whenua of New Zealand. So we know we don't compete with that. But the beauty about our relationship with New Zealand, because New Zealand through the administrator of Tokelau, who is responsible for ongoing matters and dealing with the relationship with Tokelau, we do have a voice in terms of what our priorities are. I mean, Tokelau, as I said, is very much, self-governing internally in terms of decision making, in terms of, the affairs of Tokelau internally for the people of Tokelau. New Zealand has also given power to Tokelau to make laws that are, good for the people of Tokelau internally, and also in terms of the budget support, because New Zealand provides budget support for Tokelau. New Zealand also gives that to Tokelau to handle, and Tokelau will allocate the budget according to her priorities. So very much, Tokelau is very much, has that power internally for her self-development. So what's happening in New Zealand with the Maoris, it would not affect Tokelau in terms of what's happening. But of course, through the administrator, if there's anything that we need, New Zealand need to pay attention to, or New Zealanders need to, to do much more for Tokelau, and there's always a platform for that, because the administrator of Tokelau is always present at our parliament meetings, our general fono, and also through the cabinet meetings, so that the relationship is ongoing. If there are any issues, we have the opportunity to present those issues to the government of New Zealand, especially if we feel like we are left out, we're being neglected. I would say I don't think, we have an issue with the Maoris, even with our Tokelauans, because we have about 8,000 Tokelauans residing in New Zealand, compared to the 1,600 now on Tokelau. So, and even still, the government of New Zealand has given our people, the opportunity to promote and preserve our culture, our language, our heritage. There's a lot of opportunity to do that alongside our Maori, sisters and brothers. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you very much.
And Ronnie, obviously, West Papua's slightly different context, but Indonesia too has a colonial history drawing boundaries around many different indigenous peoples, languages, cultures. Does that play into the efforts in West Papua around independence and liberation at all?
Yeah, big time. Hello. Yes, certainly. The settler colonialism certainly extend, knowing that after Indonesia obtains its independence in 1949, coming out of that Second World War and leader in that non-alignment movement. But what it's doing to the people of West Papua, it's where using the existing international law by which West Papua, as I stated earlier, arguably a trust territory, using the UN Charter to transfer. And this was using the US as well, and the USSR war, the proxy war in the 60s. And what transpired in that period of early 60s till the late 60s, like from 62 until 69, it's of critical importance to the legal and political status of West Papua, and why the call for a fair referendum. What took place in 69 was a coercion, basically, and hand-selected few of the religious and tribal leaders under duress to be part of Indonesia. And as we look at that into the contemporary situation, how Indonesia continues, the government of Indonesia continues to use this narrative of territorial integrity. And we think that many of the bilateral engagements, governments, including Australian government, are using that same line that Indonesian government wants them to say, which is reflected in many of the bilateral agreements, even in the communique, the Pacific Island Forum communique, where the leaders respect Indonesia's territorial integrity. And that word itself can be debated because of the manner in which Indonesia uses that phrase way back to expand its administration, and how it manipulated the UN law and the charters to make sure that that expansion is fully reached, which in 75 we saw the case of Timor-Leste. And that expansion was going to go further across New Guinea, but because of Australia see that there is that the fear of this expansion, West Papua was sold out, basically. And so for the case of West Papua, the liberation struggle continues, and that is why in the 60s, up until now, the national liberation movement, particularly from the armed resistance, it's still alive. Even we know that colonization is a past or distant past, in the Pacific, in this region, it's still alive. In the case of West Papua, Bougainville, Kanaki, Maui Nui. And so in the spaces when we come and talk about this unfinished decolonization or the right to self-determination and liberation of the region, often some of our post-colonial states overlook this, that within this region it's still alive. And this is where, just drawing on the conversation here, the indigenous sovereignty has become a strong force amongst the people in the fight of that recognition of self-determination and sovereignty. And we are seeing that through the youth, the roles of the youth, how have connect these issues. And with this technology that we are all kind of tapping into, where people can zoom in and learning from each other, we're seeing that happen, particularly when the pandemic hits the world. That's when I had the opportunity to even have that connection directly to some of the youths up in Guam and exchanging stories from Kanaki, exchanging similar stories and the struggles. And even in this room, in the past weeks, having that engagement as well with Brother Dennis from the learnings from the Bougainville struggle. And that is where we are seeing this surge of movement coming through again to make sure that these conversations have opportunity to enter into this kind of forums, discussions, leaders meetings, and academic spaces as well.
Ronnie, maybe we'll stay with you, because you touched on, I guess, some of the geopolitical issues in the past. But would you now, share some reflections on how the current round of geopolitics, which has certainly been, increasing the last decade, everybody's feeling it. How is that impacting on West Papua and on the struggles for independence and liberation?
Certainly, the defense and security plays a big part in the current narrative from the Indonesian government, and that's where these geopolitics tensions we're seeing in this region, the bigger powers, but also Indonesia having a newly elected president who will be inaugurated next month, what that means for the geopolitics in this region. And whilst also I just want to highlight that when the Pacific Island Leaders Summit took place in Tonga, the Defense Minister of Australia, Richard Marles, went across to Indonesia. No media, no journalists even look into this. Immediately signed the agreement of the security and military training with the President-elect Prabowo, who is also currently Defense Minister. And they're putting forward in November military training here in Australia, and also exchange of arms weapons. And we are seeing that in terms of this is happening, it's more the nation states trying to demonstrate their military power and might in the region. So what does that mean for human rights, the liberation struggles of the people on the ground? Well, what it means is that, if anything, that the land could be used for extractivism, could be used for military training, then that's what it's going to take for those states to continue this bilateral engagement, security agreements, and then using those narratives within forums such as the Pacific Island Forum meeting, where the human rights situation in West Papua just became a note or something for the leaders to only remember or recall what the leaders have committed for, particularly going back in the 2019 communique, when the Pacific leaders, when 3 paragraphs came out, one acknowledging the deteriorating human rights situation, also calling for the visit of the UN Human Rights Commissioner, and underneath that as well is acknowledging the root cause of the conflict, which is ties in with the agreements or what took place in the 60s, which the liberation struggle continues today. And to see that in one sentence, the leaders recalled of the 2019 communique and further noted the special envoy that was meant to took place before the leaders meeting, which was the last year communique. To see that, it shows that there is no concrete action from the leaders. And so we can see how the state's narrative has influenced the solidarity, the kind of solidarity that initially how the Pacific Island Forum was formed, and the principles and the values that comes with that as well. And it is a question as well for many of us here in this room to also question that, that influence of the geopolitics has meant the commitment to that very idea of self-determination, solidarity, and making sure leaving no one behind. And if we are a one ocean, why leaving out West Papua as well in that same narrative?
And we'll definitely come back to that big issue of the Pacific Islands Forum. But maybe, Ken, if you could continue, you've already touched on, how much the geopolitics is impacting. Would you share some reflections, I guess, on what you're experiencing as things continue to intensify?
Yeah, I think Guam's relationship to the United States is 100% geopolitical. I mean, that was the reason for our acquisition after the Spanish-American War. I mean, our nicknames, in addition to Where America's Day Begins, which is technically not true when you look at uninhabited territories, but is the tip of the spear. And then now when the nomenclature of the Indo-Pacific came about, we became the forward edge of the Indo-Pacific. And so part of the reason why I say, it's 100% geopolitical is because the United States and multiple military strategists and commanders have consistently said that having Guam as U.S. soil where it's located is an immensely important piece of real estate for the military, because surrounded by other allies, Japan, for example, the Philippines, they are sovereign states. And so if they wanted to change the relationship with the United States, of course, there are power politics to get through, it's still possible. For us in Guam, we don't give any consent, right? We are merely in a consultation role, if at that, right? And so our whole reason for existing under the United States flag has been military strategy and geopolitics. So in this latest round, I mean, we were using the Vietnam War, for example, Korean War, right? Andersen Air Force Base in the north has been such an important part of logistical support. Guam is a place that serves as a deterrent for the United States military says we serve as a deterrent. We serve as a place to make sure that allies in the region know that United States presence is permanent in the region. And so one military commander said, even if we withdrew all of our troops from South Korea, from Japan, if we still have Guam, then we can show our allies that we're still here. And so we become the living embodiment of credibility. We become the living embodiment of deterrence. We are a gas station, and we are a place that you build up material. We are a place that you build up troops. We are currently experiencing, in addition to the missile defense buildup, the marine relocation from Okinawa. A lot of them are coming to Guam, but also to Darwin, right? And so we're connected in those ways as well. The last thing that I'll say about how geopolitics is involved with political status, per se, is that our attempt to change our political status will threaten the unilateral ability of the United States to operate within Guam, right? Even if it is becoming the 51st state, because then we get more political power to push back. I will say, however, some policy wonks have written saying that we should make Guam a state because this will show China that there is no way you can mess with Guam. If you attack Guam, there is no more ambiguity. We have to defend Guam. They're a state. So when I read that, I was like, oh, so as of right now then, right, is there an ambiguity to that? And I think a lot of people in Guam do expect there to be some ambiguity in whether or not is Guam an expendable piece of the puzzle, or is it a place that is adequately going to get defended? With the military building up, right, in Guam for missile defense, something that is completely absent are any forms of civilian shelters, right? Any of that civilian concern. Even though the Japanese self-defense forces are building up, they're also trying to build up civilian protection. In Guam, that conversation is absent. When we've asked the military that, they've said, oh, that's for Homeland Security to deal with, not us, right? So we're seeing our true role, right? When they bombed Guam and took Guam back from the Japanese during World War II, they really were there to flatten the rock, right? It wasn't necessarily to save the Chamorro people. I think we were a byproduct of that, and we're very thankful for that, right? We're very thankful to have been, have escaped brutal Japanese occupation. But, and this is something that I always like to say, that doesn't mean that after you quote unquote liberate us, that you then can just take our land. To use a metaphor, if I saw you getting robbed in your house and I ran into your home and I beat the living crap out of the guy that was robbing you, and then tell you 10 minutes later, by the way, you're welcome, that master bedroom is now mine. No, it shouldn't be like that. But that has been such deep-seated within Guam that our quote-unquote liberation from the Japanese meant that we have to put all on the table. So from World War II to now, many of our people still hold on to the belief that we in Guam need to remain patriotic and loyal, even though loyalty is not a currency or language that the U.S. federal government recognizes for Guam self-determination. And so I think we need to change that conversation a little bit more. And that's why I believe self-determination is a much better currency to be speaking of in decolonization than simply band-aid in little integrative mechanisms with further into the United States. And so is our relationship, what role does our relationship with the United States and unfinished decolonization have with geopolitics? It is 100% everything.
So, Lihe, we obviously have heard from you. You've got a very different context to our brothers here with their struggles. Do the geopolitics impact on a smaller territory like Tokelau? How do you see this playing out?
Thank you. I was not going to respond to that question because I thought our status is very different, but I do share the frustrations that my colleagues and the colonies are going through. And I think for me, because externally New Zealand is responsible for Tokelau, but the beauty too about the relationship, New Zealand would not even do anything or extend anything, like any treaties or anything externally without Tokelau being consulted and Tokelau agreeing to it. But also and the beauty of Tokelau being part now recently an associate member of the forum, and also, Tokelau has full membership in other like the forum fisheries and the Pacific community. I think there's also another group that Tokelau, like the small island state. So there's an opportunity for Tokelau to support the common voice and the common challenges and problems that small island state or territories or even Pacific countries are experiencing. So there's an opportunity for Tokelau to be one and united with those countries at that level. And I think even if Tokelau attend, like climate change is a big issue for us, and our position really is different also from New Zealand. But there's always a consultation, and these are things that Tokelau would fight for a unique voice. And sometimes Tokelau would go with the Pacific countries, the small island state, because our issues are very common, and we can stand together as island state with a louder voice, stronger voice than Tokelau, because we can't go on our own at that level. We must, everything we say externally must align to New Zealand, but New Zealand has always given Tokelau the space to voice its concerns or its issues. But yes, but I definitely support and understand the frustrations that our our colleagues and their colleagues are going through.
Thanks, Lee. We stay with you and have a continue the conversation, I guess, around the United Nations and the Pacific Islands Forum. So obviously the UN's got its responsibilities, to oversee decolonisation. You're on their list, and in the region, as Ronnie said, the forum, it's in its DNA. It was founded around self-determination, and membership was based on self-determination. What's been your experience with these institutions in Tokelau?
Thank you. I'll try to look for my note to make sure I speak to fact. I think Tokelau has been regularly attending and presenting at the UN or the C24 committee meetings every year alongside New Zealand. So Tokelau would have the opportunity to present its own voice, its own story of how Tokelau is preparing for self-determination, because the question is still on the table, despite our due referendum, that we did not meet the 2/3 required for us to be self-determined. I think Tokelau, the issue is still on the table. There's a lot of preparation that Tokelau would want to focus on, and that's what Tokelau has been highlighting and voicing in those UN forums. Tokelau, it's a small, it's a coral atoll, 1,500 people, isolated. Our infrastructures still very much need to be strengthened in terms of, even transportation, communication. So there are a lot of issues for health. Our people will get medivated to Samoa or New Zealand, and education too. So these things are still very much an issue. And also, despite that we manage our public service, but we're still very limited in resources and human capacities. So these are areas that Tokelau highlight as priorities that we want New Zealand, to continue to prepare Tokelau for, and we continue to voice them at the UN. If there's one area that I like to really focus on, that I think I would like the UN, and this is my personal view. Being a legal advisor, I was, for the government for many years. Now I'm in New Zealand in the private sector. Is our judicial sector. Because, the High Court of New Zealand is our High Court, the Court of Appeal of New Zealand is our Court of Appeal. And even though that's what it's written and under the Act, but it's physically separated. And to travel to New Zealand, you have to go through Samoa to get to New Zealand by boat 24 hours. So, and I just imagine the complexities that our people, if they have to, because the jurisdictions of our commissioners, our law commissioners who are like similar to lay judges on the atolls are just limited to the minor petty crimes. Anything civil is, limited to 1,000. So if anybody wanted to go beyond that, they have to go to the High Court in New Zealand. So these are things what Tokelau was preparing for the last 2 referendum. These are things that we tried our very best to firm up and to strengthen with New Zealand, to give clarity in terms of, because even we were going for self-determination in free association. Almost like the status quo, but formalized. Then our constitution become the highest laws of Tokelau, because at the moment it is not. So these are things that I hope, in terms of the UN listening to all our report, because and also making sure and watching, because New Zealand, UN, we see them as our protector. Making sure that the UN is really monitoring the process, and that New Zealand is actually doing what New Zealand is supposed to be doing for Tokelau. So these are things I think I would like to see improvement on these areas, that our people can easily access justice, not like, because working out who's going to pay for the cost, the legal cost, and under whose rules, whether the Tokelau, because in this court we have New Zealand judges, we have New Zealand lawyers, practitioners, standing for our people. So, and using the English language, and this is also very foreign. And we have judges, New Zealand judges, who are also not familiar with the local context and issues of our people. So these are some challenges that I think, under the current colonial legal system that we have, that I like to see improved. And I guess we still have a long journey to get to. Preaching the gap, making sure that our people can easily access justice in a timely manner. Thank you.
Do you, just before you finish, do you see any role for this for the Pacific Islands Forum? You're an associate member. Does the Pacific Islands Forum play any role in? No.
Thank you, because I understand the Pacific Island Forum. I mean, it was established to look at this, common issues and challenges that member countries are facing, and how they can come together and properly promote them to the bigger countries, like to the big powers like New Zealand, Australia, and other. I like to think so. I mean, I wasn't really sure whether the Pacific Forum has a self-determination mandate to really, and it's an opportunity for Tokelau to promote its issues there. I'm not really sure if we ever use that forum to do that for Tokelau, because we do have a direct relationship with New Zealand that we can work things out. But it's an opportunity if these are issues that small countries are facing, and definitely the Pacific Island Forum should have a role in looking to deeply these issues to make sure that no one is left behind. I think it's important. Thank you.
Thank you. Ronnie, you've already spoken about, you've obviously got a very different perspective on the UN, and you've spoken about the historic complicity of the UN for West Papua. The Pacific Islands Forum obviously West Papua has been on the agenda for some years now. It only got on the agenda in that brief moment of time when the forum opened up its leaders' agenda to more consultation with civil society, and there was a strong push that West Papua be talked about. Can you share some of your reflections, I guess, on where you see the UN's role now with respect to West Papua, but also, I guess, a little bit more on what you've seen over the last few years with the communiques and where you think things are heading with the Pacific Islands Forum?
Thank you. For the UN role on the case of West Papua, it's a long journey to really come to that. Given that what transpired in '69, and the outcome of that has been the narrative that many nation states kind of like use that as a reference point, that West Papua is a territory of Indonesia and continues to maintain that line. So to bring West Papua case back to the UN Safe Decolonisation Committee, or even one of the UN member states to even address that at the UN Human Rights Council or even General Assembly, would require a lot of that support from other UN member states to really garner that support. And also, when it comes to the case of West Papua, there is no recognition of the political movement. And that lack of recognition of the movement has meant that the Papuans have to lobby, knock to the doors on the Melanesian spearhead group bloc, even to the Pacific Island Forum grouping, and to leverage on that to really garner that support and the numbers to kind of like amplify it further, whether to the African, Caribbean, Pacific, and even to the UN General Assembly. And that is a long road to really kind of like reach that when it comes to that pathway back to the UN. However, what is really needed at this stage is not the silence from the region. Firstly, from the Melanesian subgrouping, it requires that leadership from the Melanesian bloc to really champion West Papua case. And that should be brought as well, that championing that to the Pacific Island Forum. And what we saw comes out of the 2019 communique was the build-up of that. And as you highlighted, that when the leaders open up for that consultation on what are some of the pressing issues in the region, West Papua was on the third, amongst other issues. And that's how the leaders came to realize that, yes, this is an issue within the Pacific that we need to really look into it and commit to it. So that was reflected in the 2019 communique. And it was also kind of like a moment of that leaving no one behind. And we saw the leaders in 2016, 17, addressing it at the UN General Assembly. At least 7 Pacific head of states addressing the human rights situation and then galvanizing that support in their communique. However, the government of Indonesia as well recognized that support and swiftly also lobbied intensively in the region and have increased the focus in the region with, if this year alone, if we see there's already 2 parliamentary visits to Jakarta, and they've already opened up diplomatic trainings for mid-career diplomats in the Pacific and facilitated through the MSG and also some of the diplomats within the PIF Secretariat. And so this is also extending to the bilateral engagement in education, business to business, and we're seeing that evident with Papua New Guinea, particularly within the last 6-7 months. Things have really ramped up, particularly with scholarships opening up for Papua New Guinea students to go and study in Indonesia or in Jakarta and other universities. We're also seeing that now in the business-to-business relationship, and underlying that is the military engagement. And as we know that now the Pope Francis visiting Indonesia, arriving yesterday and today, and then in the next few days, and also will be visiting Papua New Guinea. There's been also conversations around what about the human rights situation. And as the leader of the Catholic religion, that represents the symbol of peace and justice, these are conversations that through faith-based leaders in West Papua are organizing a pilgrimage march to carry the cross and addressing that situation in West Papua. And this is also going to be translated into Papua New Guinea from the grassroots. But when it comes to the state engagement, that bilateral relationship, we respect that bilateral, but that should not come at the expense of human rights. They should not come at the expense of the environmental destruction. That should not come at the expense of this conversation around going into the Freeport-McMoran to learn from what the Freeport-McMoran is doing and then extending that across to Papua New Guinea and other minings in Papua New Guinea. And this is where, when we see the weakening of the language reflected in the communique, just because of those engagement on bilateral and disagreements on defense, security, and other relationships through bilateral, that weakens that in terms of as a collective effort to find some concrete actions. And that's where also we see the silencing of the leaders when it comes to talk about the human rights situation alone, let alone the liberation struggle, which is something that is way far, that they won't be touched. But when we talk about that through the indigenous sovereignty movement, that garnered that support. And this is where, for West Papuans as well, and we're looking at that across in the region, when we connect those shared struggles from that sovereignty movement lens, that is where we see that the issue is still much alive. But when it comes to the state and the multilateralism, that engagement, that's where it weakens. That's where the issue is not kind of garnered or supported at the top. But from the grassroots, it is swelling. There is that surge amongst the youths, amongst the civil society organizations, pushing it through those corridors of powers and in forums to make sure not just West Papua, but the issue of self-determination, the right to self-determination, human rights, environmental justice, indigenous sovereignty are discussed at in those spaces.
Yeah, and I think we're all grateful that West Papua remains on the agenda and hopeful that that political discussion, at least it can remain there, but very saddening to see the weakening of the language year after year. Can Guam's obviously on the UN's list as well. If you would share some reflections, I guess, around how how the UN operates in your context. But I imagine what everyone's more interested in hearing from you on is new status as associate member of the forum. So joining now American Samoa and Tokelau as associate members in the Pacific Islands Forum. I recall the first time I met you, you were advocating for Guam's admission as an associate member, and you said, because this is about self-determination, and a senior Pacific regional public servant told you, those days are long gone. If that's what you're looking, for out of this engagement. So if you could reflect a bit, I guess, on how you see Guam's new status and what it might mean for self-determination and independence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something about Canberra. When I was here last year, right, that's when we first expressed interest in associate membership. I come back and we got it. So maybe I need to make more frequent visits to ANU to advance Guam's role in the region. But yes, I think what we were trying to achieve and what we always wanted to achieve is that for many of us, when FESPAC was held in Guam in 2016, for many of our people, that was like, oh, there are more Pacific Islanders in all of this various, but we just don't have that connection with the quote-unquote South Pacific. And I think we in Guam should not have been isolated from a regional agenda, an initiative. And so us seeking associate membership, which is not voting, right? I will oppose any full voting membership for Guam as long as our current status is a colony of the United States. But I do think associate membership, which gets us in the room a little bit more, is a great way for Guam to learn from the region and to share insights from what we have. And there's a lot of commentary. Is Guam going to be the Trojan horse for the United States of America? Well, number one, that's why I'm saying we shouldn't be a voting member. That's my own personal opinion as an academic. And there are legitimate concerns. I think that's a legitimate concern. But also I think there needs to be a mutual reflection. How many are members of PIF or individuals within those realms going to use Guam to try to get to the United States? Are we going to be used as the Trojan horse to you to get things from the United States? That's something that we have also reflected on. I'm not saying that that is going to happen. I'm just saying there should be some mutual reflection before simply saying that Guam and the government of Guam has no agency and we are just a Trojan horse. I think that's just so disrespectful to our own agency, even if that ends up being a struggle that we have. Give us an opportunity to engage in the region. We already said associate membership, non-voting, that's at least a step forward. But give us some respect in our own agency as even if we're a colony. And I'm sorry for getting a little bit passionate about that, but it is really horrible to get spoken down to consistently because we lack sovereignty, like we're the ones that are causing our own lack of sovereignty. I think Guam, having international personality, needs to maximize its external engagement whenever those possibilities arise, right? As a non-self-governing territory, we're already a full member of the Pacific community, for example, but we also we have to maximize that responsibility, that opportunity, but on our own, we need to make sure that we do right by the Pacific. This is a mutual street. We can't just say we're opening the door here to get more involved in the region, and then we don't feel a reciprocity, which is inherent Pacific value, to the region. So I think our involvement in PIF, what we hope to gain, is really building networks, building conversation, maximizing our external engagement. With the UN, sometimes I wonder if we're going to have to wait till the 76th decade on the eradication of colonialism. We're currently on the 4th. Maybe it will take, I don't know how many decades more. But I think the UN is not our savior in Guam. It is a tool to be used, right? It is an important tool, but it is not a basket in which you put all of your eggs, right? One thing that we're trying to push for in Guam, and we're trying to work with the U.S. State Department, is to get a visiting mission to Guam. The last time the United States approved a visiting mission is because there was a constitutional convention, by the way, in which they said, oh, this new constitution, though, must not deviate from the current federal-territorial relationship. But let's invite the UN to show that we're allowing you to exercise your self-determination, right? But we believe a UN visiting mission is an important aspect of how the United Nations can help. But ultimately, there are also subsidiary organs of the United Nations that Guam, as an NSGT, can have access to associate membership of. So I think that we need to, overall, coordinate and centralize our mechanisms for external engagement as allowed, exercising power diplomacy. But lastly, I think what the Pacific can do overall, I think we in the non-sovereign Pacific need to talk to each other a lot more. We need to organize our own conferences. We need to go visit each other's locations, right? We need to see what are the shared mechanisms of colonial control to legitimize dependency. And I think once we start comparing and contrasting these mechanisms, we can have a better game plan to work together as the non-sovereign Pacific. I think that there's a lot more work in that realm to organize the non-sovereign Pacific. We haven't seen a lot of that really since NFIP, right, as we were talking about. It is time to re-engage, and I think that the United Nations and the Pacific Islands forums are good tools to use. And I think for us, for PIF, one thing that I always think about is Peleaofa talks about a sea of islands. How do you actualize that? And is your sea of islands or your blue continent predicated on the exclusion of those of us who have been invisibilized for too long? Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So maybe before we hand over to the audience and get some more perspectives or questions for you all, it's certainly, you know, a common way of thinking in this country that colonisation is over. You've certainly powerfully illustrated that that's far from the truth, and obviously the work that you all do in confronting these realities and advocating for your people is really significant and really brave. So maybe just in closing, if you would each share, you know, an example, a story, or something that sort of vividly illustrates what this experience is like for you.
And it's a story. Okay. I was at a lavender farm in Maui when my mother called me crying. Really exasperated gasp. She said, "Son, they're going to bomb us." And she was referring to the North Korean missile threat in 2013 towards Guam. And I was at this lavender farm enjoying myself, and all I felt was immense guilt that I wasn't going to be there. If this was true, that I wasn't going to be there to dissipate along with my family. In a separate story, I was playing with my daughter in our backyard in Guam, and a military aircraft flies overhead. She runs to me, also crying, hugs me, and says, "Tata, I'm scared." I hug her tight and say, "I'll always do my best to try and protect you. But my best is not going to stop the world." That's what I wanted to think about. And so if we're talking about the daily experiences of being a militarized colony, it's about being a pawn in geopolitics. It's about being something or someone that is expendable, that your precarious position in life is predicated upon how great powers view their relationships with each other. When that is your existence, then you are living. You are the living embodiment of militarized colonialism. That is our life in Guam.
Thank you. I think what I'm going to share, it's a very recent experience that I've experienced, and as a Tokelauan, that is, even though I live in New Zealand, but I'm still very much passionate about Tokelau, and I pray and hope that the day will come when Tokelau is really ready. Because there are, you know, I forgot to mention in the last two referendum that Tokelau had to, there was a lot of, there was great influence by our Tokelauans residing in New Zealand and Australia. And, you know, like properly telling their families to vote no. And this was mainly because probably is their fear or the lack of understanding of the option of free association that Tokelau was going for, because really free association when we took our people through that was really the best option for Tokelau, because we are already almost like living that. self-governing. It was just formalizing that because New Zealand was not going to let us go. But in saying that, there are also still very much room for improvement that I think that in terms of the UN's role in New Zealand, that I'd like to see a lot of improvement in that area. And there was, as I said, the High Court of New Zealand is our High Court. Rarely, probably by 2026, Tokelau will be under New Zealand for about 100 years. And there's only been probably about 9 judgments from the High Court of Tokelau, New Zealand, no appeals. But very recently, one mother cried to me because in the High Court also sit as a family court for Tokelau, and there are no precedent, and that's a huge challenge because you have New Zealand judges sitting on those matters, adjudicating Tokelau matters for our people back in the islands through New Zealand lawyers or practitioners. So this was a court hearing, family matter, no precedent to guide the New Zealand judge, and also to was more like my fear, if our own people can use that opportunity, because when I say our own people, the government, is a way to do the things they want to, because this was a hearing without notice, and this was a wardship order. And this was very personal to me because I see this as, it's almost like it's a negative impact of colonization because of the legal structure that we have. And because of it's almost like a separate court outside Tokelau, because this mother, she only received the decision of the court to tell her that she no longer has the right to her child. Another, this was like a wardship order that her child was removed from her. So I, as a Tokelauan and a lawyer, I was not away for her. I'm now acting as a more like interpreter and translator for her, connecting her. I was really sad. I was really sad, especially, if those are in power, our own people, they will look for leadership. Because of power, but because of resources, because of connections. We know, when in government you can connect to government, like New Zealand, the people, the resources, and it's not problem for you. You can stand as the government, but when you look at your people from the grassroots, and I could see that this is what I thought, I feel for my people, and I see that this is a system under colonialism that I and I don't want our people to use each other through that system. We need to rise above that. And my only wish that we see, our people see this. We can't, this is a system that was imposed on us. This is not our system. We can do better than this. So, we still have a long way to go. So this is a very recent personal experience to me, and that's why I chose, I'm going to do something about it as part of my study, because I think access to justice is very important for my people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to also reflect, when it comes to West Papua, it's the question of why is the resistance to self-determination continues to be that issue within this region, in the Pacific. And there is this common saying amongst the West Papuans in Bahasa, it goes like, kalau bukan ko, siapa lagi? If it's not you, who else? And that's a challenge always amongst the Papuans. And I just want to also put that out back to the audience and in this room. If it's not you using your voice, your skill set, your position, then who else will be the voice of the marginalized, the voiceless? This was reflected in the 60s when one of West Papua's musicologists and anthropologists, Anolap, who went around and collected songs when he knew that this struggle is a long fight. And when he was in the prison, he reflected on the reality, and he wrote this beautiful poem. And in those words, he reflected that West Papua is like a prison whilst he was in that small cell. He even recorded that into a song and passed that through the prison guard, recorded that on a reel-to-reel tape, passed on to the prison guard to give it to his wife. And this is the words that he reflected while he was in prison, are loosely translated, which titles, The Mystery of Life. This is the life, full of mystery. You can't imagine, neither foresee. This is how it is, the reality. I am a prisoner, locked within my world. Just imagine that. I'm an eagle flying on high, soaring above and searching below. But what an unlucky fate, only to be hunted and killed. And he finishes by saying, what I dream for is what I'll wait for or continue to fight for. There's nothing else, only freedom. And this is the words that continues to resonate from generations amongst the Papuans. And where I see my role in the struggle for independence, music has been, or even spoken word, has been the weapon of choice to continue to use that music to amplify the struggles of the people and the land. So for us, the struggle is in the words, and the words speaks about the struggle. Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing with us something of the realities for yourselves and for your people. I'm sure those stories are sitting quite heavy in everyone's hearts, but you know, we do need to not avoid discomfort. We do need to lean into it. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge the realities, even in the case of Tokelau, where you've spoken of a constructive engagement, but there are still, very real world impacts for people. So I know that that's heavy, but that is the nature of what we're talking about. We've got plenty of time now. This was supposed to be a conversation, so we now have plenty of time for you all to join in the conversation, ask your own questions, share your own experiences, your own thoughts on any of the questions that I guess we've discussed so far. Where's our microphones? Have we got more mics or these ones?
I could shout to get things going.
We've got one up the back, Mike.
In the lavender field, and I guess if you're North Korea, a way to attack America without attacking America is to attack Guam. And we've seen quite a lot of that in the Middle East in the last 12 months. We've seen quite a number of indigenous Bedouins killed in the middle of deserts in the Middle East in the context of Iran attacking a tiny American base in terms of number of soldiers, but some Bedouins get killed along the way. And even in the Pacific, in a different kind of way, we've seen that in recent months with President Macron saying that Azerbaijan would never attack France over our European conflicts in France, but they're attacking us in New Caledonia. So what do we learn from Guam about how the rest of the Pacific needs to think about having military bases from any major power, whether they're US, China, France, whatever?
Yeah, that's a test. I don't know if this is on. Is this on? There it is. Oh, there it is. All right. Yeah, I think that's a good question. The last time I was here, the United States was really trying to make a renewed push into the Pacific. via the opening of embassies, right? We got Vanuatu, Tonga, Solomon Islands. I know they're waiting on, I think, parliamentary approval for Kiribati. But at the same time, there was talks of Papua New Guinea, for example, and then now an Australian territory, I think, has been identified within the Pacific Deterrence Initiative as a potential site. Cocos Island, I believe Cocos is the name, right? I think it's Cocos and Keeling, but Cocos Island particularly has been identified. And so I think, the best thing to understand from our example is that it's an incredibly complex process, because when you have United States military bases coming through, you are inevitably also going to have the promise of economic development, right? And so if your community is really struggling economically, quite often that becomes the bargaining chip to establish military access and potentially military bases as well. This will bring money. And for example, the contractor community loves it, right? In November, we have a huge conference talking about all the billions of dollars that are going to come through Guam. So all the contractors are going to have a nice conference at a hotel in Guam in November to talk about how to maximize that. So I think that's a warning sign that I would give, is that just weigh it, right? You have to weigh those things, because it's going to be incredibly powerful. I'll be talking about Palau tomorrow, but just give you a little bit of a hint. In the island of Peleliu, for example, the hotel there has been consistently occupied by U.S. Marines. And so that's good for their economy, as many of their leaders are saying. But at what cost? I think that's the question that needs to ruminate whenever there's a U.S. military approaches you and says, let's talk about base. Let's talk about building a base, or, and there are different nomenclatures for base. There are bases like forward operating bases. There are lily pads. So just be careful about nomenclature as well. But the largest warning, ask yourselves at what cost, because in Guam, in 2016, when FESPAC happened, we had brothers and sisters from the Pacific saying, wow, Guam is incredibly developed. And they were like, wow, you're incredibly sovereign, right? So you have to weigh these things out, right? You have to weigh these things out and realize that, is there another path to economic development that is not contingent upon putting yourselves as a perpetual pawn in a geopolitical chessboard, to use an outdated metaphor. But that would be my answer to your question.
Hi, thank you all so much. Really moving presentations. Margaret Jolly, I'm here at ANU. I was just sort of thinking about that wonderful book of Tracy Bunavanua-Mars on decolonisation in the Pacific, where she talks about these really crucial questions about lowering flags, raising flags, and how the movement for decolonisation is a much deeper, an upwelling from the ocean of cultural, linguistic revitalisation. And so in that spirit, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. Ronnie, your kind of reflections on the narrative of 1969 and that coerced agreement, so-called. I mean, the problem, I think, with a lot of the institutional forms is that they are so state-centric and so predicated on brutal boundaries created by colonialism, which have generated all of these contradictions about sovereignty in different ways. So, I mean, in order to kind of legitimate the decolonisation of Indonesia and their independence against European colonisers, that territorial integrity gets supported. And one could say the same thing about Papua New Guinea vis-a-vis Bougainville. So I think that, what sort of came up in terms of the non-sovereign countries and, I mean, these questions about how to get that sort of regional sense of decolonial solidarity, which in a way sort of escapes the state-centrism of the UN itself, of PIF and most of the kind of regional organisations. I mean, so I think that's just a comment, and I just wanted you to think about that. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that absolutely awesome panel. That was really, really brilliant and raised so many important questions and reflections for all of us, I think. Ken has referred regularly to FESPAC as a particular regional moment for Guam, and Ronnie literally used the arts to express his reflections and thoughts on decolonization, historical oppression and solidarity building. And Tokelau is a powerhouse of the arts, in my thinking, for anyone who knows the global impact of Te Waka. So my question is, I have two questions. One is about the arts and regionalism, and the second one is about environment and land, reflecting on our amazing keynote this morning. So I was recently at the Festival of Pacific Arts in Hawaii, which will require a year of reflection and unpacking. Soli was there, and we literally need to like debrief ourselves on what just happened. But at FESPAC, people stood up at the end, at the closing ceremony, and expressed their, they protested for demilitarization, for deoccupation, for freedom in West Papua and Guam and Kanaki, and they were told off by the host from the Polynesian Cultural Center for protesting while the governor of Hawaii and his wife were speaking. So you had a very interesting clash of perceptions about culture and how to be polite, diplomatic, and participate in good protocols and diplomacy versus this really critical, urgent issue of sovereignty, self-determination, demilitarization, freedom, all of those things. The whole entire stadium was silent and did not support the protesters in the way that I thought that they would. So my question is, because often in these regional contexts and discussions about geopolitics and development, the arts is minor, is treated as minor and insignificant to the serious discussions afoot. However, the arts are a critical vehicle for actually expressing many of the issues you raised around decolonization, self-determination, sovereignty, a sense of dignity in the face of a colonizing history. So I wonder if you could all reflect on that, because each of the contexts you come from have utilized the arts in a very, very powerful way to address these issues. The second one is the land. So we heard an incredible keynote this morning talking about understanding the land. The rocks speak, the land speaks. When people say, Guam is so developed, it's so amazing, look at all the amazing things you have, do they not feel the heat of the concrete oppressively, colonizing your very body in this land that the United States military covered in concrete? So the physical environment is part of that colonization, urbanization of certain kind of concrete-dominated urbanization requiring air conditioning is part of that colonization. And then there are these histories of extraction and mining and resource, needs that are part of the Indonesian story in the colonization and holding on to of West Papua. So my question for the panel are these two issues, the arts and the critical role of the arts to the theme of the panel, and then the land, and really unpacking what has happened to the land. Because we can talk about human rights, but the message from this morning is healing the land and the waterways. Thank you.
I'm so glad that we have those two questions, because I'm going to do a double mea culpa here with my timekeeper over there. I've been looking at Ken's watch, so I thought we had another half an hour. Yeah. It says 5 to 11, so, and Ope just told me we have 1 minute, so I'm so glad you got those 2 questions in. They will be the final questions, but we have 2 days together. There will be kava in Coombs every day, so if you want to continue the conversation, we'll make sure these people are there, and I really apologise for that. He told me he's on the same time zone, so I was like, sweet, I'll just look at his watch.
You go first for the first one. And then
Oh, quick answers. I think Guam was created really in our creation story. A brother and sister, she takes his body and turns it into the land, and she turns herself into a rock, and we, the first people, emerge. I think that if we referred back to an indigenous cosmology of literally we are stepping on our ancestor every time we walk and build, I think it would do much better in how we view development and how we view respecting the land.
with regards to the role of art, it is certainly what transpired from the FESPAC. Just reflecting, because the year before, FESPAC, it's the Melanesian Festival of Arts. And what came from there is a representation of West Papua musicians, so we put a band together. But from the state, the government of Indonesia also brings in another band of West Papuans, also attending the Melanesian Festival of Arts. But what the organizers did was that they allow the freedom of expression on stage with the flag, with the even the protest actions happening on the fringes of the festival. But it truly brings that sense of solidarity and what it means in terms of the pressing issues. And probably just to respond to that is we need arts practitioners, artists in the spaces where FESPAC is. And that is something that these conversations, kind of like outside this room, needs to happen, is bringing the artists together and providing that advice to the state agencies when putting these shows for FESPAC or even for Melanesian Festival of Arts or even festivals that is in the region and addressing these critical issues. Like, we shouldn't be scared to talk about these issues or even freely raising flags or even just to sing songs of resistance or protest songs. It's important because in this region, like, I feel that's something that came out very strongly in the 70s with the NFIP movement, and it is really needed right now as we also moving into the geopolitical tensions and things that are happening around. The spirit of NFIP is really needed right now, moving forward. And if it's artist-led, indigenous-led, youth-led, would be a Pacific that we all want, and that idea of leaving no one behind will truly reflect on that.
Thank you very much. I think for me, art, that's something colonialism cannot take away from us, because that is our pride, national pride. In Tokelau, we strongly participated in all those specific festivals because that is nationhood, solidarity for Tokelau, and we are very thankful that we were given the opportunity to compose our own anthem. We have our own flag. We have our own national emblem too, and we showcase them. And this is a national identity that we are allowed to showcase to the world, who we are as a people. And it gives us, when you listen to our Tokelau national anthem, where if you're Tokelau and you know the language, it just gives you goosebumps. You feel in your bones and who you are. It's so critical to our people. So we can't hide away, and nobody can take it away, even colonialism. And in terms of our land, that is customary to us, and there's nothing New Zealand can do to that. That is ours, and we preserve that, and it's very much protected under our custom and culture tradition. Thank you very much.